Okay, before we get on to our last speaker of the day, I just have a couple of thank yous and acknowledgments that I would like to cover before we wrap up. Ashley, if you wouldn't mind, please, could you scroll back to the CTE cover? So I think many of you in the room are very much aware of the work that has been done over, Stu, how many years now? 5? 5 years on the topic of CTE, continuing tech ed. And their successes have been increasing and growing over the years. Most notably, the Career Tech Ed publication that is produced on an annual basis to really help communicate, educate, and motivate folks to consider the trades has been certainly one of those success stories. And I think we're proud to be able to unveil this year's cover of the edition that you will begin to see this weekend. Is that correct? Flannel Day. Thank you for reminding me. So kind of a spin on Platter Day. This will be Flannel Day for the big unveiling. So stay tuned. And for those that have been participating and supporting the effort, please continue to do so. It is making a difference. So thank you, Stu, and thanks for the cover. The other piece that I wanted to touch on before we move on is that an event like this doesn't happen with a lot of support and heavy lifting going on kind of behind the scenes, and certainly that's very much the case for Operation Action UP. We wouldn't be able to do an event like this without the support that we get from the Lake Superior Community Partnership and its staff. And at this time, Ashley and Emily, if you both would please come up. We have a couple of items that we would like to present to you as a bit of a thank you. So give them a warm round of applause. Now, at this point, my co-chair, I'm sure, is believing that she's going to be making an introduction. But before we do, I want to take one last opportunity to say a few words before we wrap up. Many of you have come to recognize Tawny as one of the co-chairs that has been responsible for putting this event on for how many years have we been doing this together now? Probably close to 10?
At least. It's
maybe
been
even
wonderful,
more.
but it's been a long time, yeah.
I think if I recall correctly, John Marshall and his co-chair at the time, Dave Molinaire, said that we have to do it for at least 10 years, and I think we probably hit that. And as a result, several of you may also know that Tawny is in the process of transitioning from her role here in the Upper Peninsula as a strong advocate for economic development and growth to the state of Missouri, if I'm not mistaken.
Actually, we're going global right now, so it's
Even
wonderful.
better.
But my home is in Missouri right now. In my mother's basement, may I add? I didn't get the note on the age requirement.
So, it's with thanks and gratitude for your many years of service as co-chair and your tireless efforts to perpetuate the economic growth throughout the Upper Peninsula that we present you with, again, another fine creation from Dave Stimmick at Nature's Way. So, Tawny.
Thank you. Oh, my gosh. Yeah. No, leave it there. Yeah. This is beautiful. Thank you.
And with that, I'll let you introduce our keynote.
Well, all of you know that I always have something to say, and this was prepped for the board meeting after this meeting, so I think everybody from the board meeting is here. So, whoa. Thank you. There are so many people in this room that have contributed to my successes. Get up here, Brett. Come on. You can't make me do this, Joe. This was supposed to be in the board meeting, and now they're recording it. But you've done it. And Tom Baldini is right here. He's an amazing man. Oh, my God. All right, here we go. Yep. All right. So it's through your excellent presentations, engaging meetings, and sound advice, and deep, deep passion and wisdom that you've shaped me, and you've prepared me to go on. And I've learned from all of you, Youpers, 1, you value people first. 2, you work hard and be creative. 3, you do so much with so little. And then 4th is you take on challenges when other people, especially those below the bridge, would just shrug their shoulders and say, forget it. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of this and so much more. And know that you're going to be firmly planted in my heart and in my soul. And whatever I go on to do, you are going to be with me. And I'm eternally thankful. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. That was supposed to be at the board meeting, so you're not getting it a second time. But all of us, Tom, you would be so proud. You would. So with that, now you get to look at the person who's responsible for hiring me. And his name is Howard Wall. Yeah. With that, I am so excited. It's incredible to be a part of the Hammond Institute. Howard Wall is an amazing person from which I have learned so much in a relatively short period of time. He directs the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise at Lindenwood University. We're located in St. Charles, Missouri, just outside of St. Louis. He is an excellent professor of economics. He does a ton of research from which I've benefited and I've learned more. I'm actually a Research 1 economist, and I'm honing those skills and bringing them back to my heart and my soul, which is really incredible because I did my graduate work at Washington University in St. Louis. So prior to joining Lindenwood in 2011, Howard actually was a vice president at the St. Louis Fed. He brought his expertise, his regional knowledge, and his international work to Lindenwood from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. He began his career in economics. He's worked at he got his degree, his PhD at West Virginia University, and he's worked at the University of London, and it's with great, great pleasure that I introduce Howard Wall, everyone.
Thank you very much. Am I on now?
No, here.
No, I'm supposed to have there it is. I have the clip on. No, I got it.
No, you got it?
And you can see how we work together every day.
All right, he has colorful language. All right, there. Okay, good.
Well, thank you very much.
It's still not up there.
It'll be fine.
Okay.
I'm really overjoyed to be here in the Upper Peninsula. Since Tawny came and joined us a year and a half ago, she talks nothing. It's the thing she talks most about, how much she loved it here. The 20 years or so she was living in Marquette. And so it was great to be able to come up and to really get the full UP. The snow, thank you very much for all that. I saw that yesterday. The car stuck in the snowbank yesterday, having to push it out. That was great. And I have to say, I thought it was going to be rough. Hugo and I were talking, and I thought I would be following just puppies, but now I'm following puppies, then Tawny, and I'm talking about taxes. So, thank you for the challenge. And actually, I wonder if the beer guy is still here. Within 4 hours of being in Marquette, I had 3 of your beers already, which is a testament to the quality of your beer and to the culture of the Upper Peninsula. So I'm very happy to have partaken in that. Now, since it's I'm the last speaker, so it's all the challenges are there. But taxes is what everyone cares about deeply, especially the details of taxes. You love doing your taxes. You love hearing about all the details of the tax laws. So here we go. All right, now my topic is tax cuts work. And I was thinking of putting in a question mark in that because it is a question about how tax cuts work and if they do. And they do work to do some things, but not everything. So I'm going to talk about, in particular, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which was the the recent federal tax reform, the first in 31 years that had been done. And it had some pluses and minuses, but let me just give you a quick overview of the main parts of the tax overhaul. Now, it's a very complicated bill. Lots and lots of things changed. Corporate taxes, personal taxes, and even excise taxes, inheritance taxes. It was really comprehensive in the coverage of the changes. Although it was not nearly the type of reform that was needed, it did change the tax code in the direction, largely in the direction of having a sensible tax code. Now, there are really just two main principles of tax policy, and that is that you should have low tax rates, right? Because businesses and everybody else, you make decisions at the margin, right? You think, well, if I invest in this plant and I make $1 million, well, I'm going to lose 30% of that, right? You think about at the margin, not your average taxes, but your decisions on whether to do more based on your marginal tax rate. So the optimal tax code should have the lowest rates possible. And the way to achieve that is to have the broadest base possible. So you don't have lots and lots of deductions and carve-outs or use the tax code for spending, because that's incredibly inefficient. And you just end up having to raise the tax rates in order to finance all of that. So any reforms or movements towards flattening the tax code so that you have low rates but broadening the base should be welcome. And the bills that were actually passed went largely in that direction at least, although there's an awful lot more work to be done, but I can't imagine anything else being done maybe for another 30 years. But let's just look at some of the changes that did happen. All right, so I list them here, and it's largely a business audience, so the corporate tax code changes might be important to you, but for most businesses in the United States, it's the personal income tax code that was most important, because the vast majority of businesses are pass-through entities, right? So your taxes are passed through from your business to you, and you declare it on your personal income tax. So all the changes in the personal income tax code were important to businesses also. All right, so just to highlight some of these changes, the corporate tax code, the top rate was dramatically reduced from 35% to 21%. Now, there weren't actually that many corporations that were paying 35%, because there were all sorts of adjustments and deductions and everything like that. And a lot of those were whittled away also. But again, remember, the key is to get a lower rate. So just lowering the rate was important, because it means that for each extra dollar, right, because we want growth to come out of this, each extra dollar of sales that a firm does will be taxed at a lower rate, so it will do the investments to get those extra sales, right? And the base was broadened also, so there weren't huge revenue cuts out of this. And then there was also a corporate alternative minimum tax, just like there is for personal income taxes, and that was completely eliminated, because it just makes it it's just too complex, and firms need to know how much they're going to be paying in taxes. They need to plan, and if the alternative minimum tax fits in, it's like having two tax codes and then not knowing which one you're going to be using until the end of the year. So that was good to get rid of that, to simplify the code. And as I said, the other main, like most businesses are pass-through entities. The biggest change there was a 20% deduction that's been allowed, right? So the business, your business makes a profit, you get your returns on that, you get your pay from your own company, and you get to deduct up to 20% of that before it's then taxed on your personal income taxes. And there are limitations on that, but I think it's 300,000 or something like this is the maximum you could do, and there's all sorts of complications to it. But most businesses are able to take this 20% deduction before the taxes are levied. And this was also a way to kind of even out the taxes between being a corporation and being a pass-through entity, like a partnership or your own personal business or an LLC. So since I think it's 80, 90% of businesses are pass-through entities, this was an incredibly important change that I think was really overlooked a lot in the discussion about tax reform. It was all about the corporations and then the personal code. But I think in the end, this will end up being as important as any of the other changes in spurring growth. Now, for the personal tax code, one key to this, you'll see at the end of all of the sentences, it's through 2025. Right? The corporate tax code was amended permanently, but the personal taxes were only through 2025. And this was largely because in Washington they have to do a 10-year scoring of every bill. So they monkey around with the length of the tax cuts so that the 10-year scoring looks better. Right? And what they're anticipating is that somewhere between now and 2025 they'll make it permanent, or that's the hope. But it's really just it's an artificial deadline to the tax cuts, but it's just because they have to do this scoring, which started out as a really good idea. Now it's just manipulated for different purposes. All right, so the individual ordinary income tax rates, they were all lowered a bit. And the big change was that there's now a standard deduction. There's a huge standard deduction for an individual. It's $12,000, and if you're filing jointly, it's $24,000. So that's a huge increase in the standard deduction. Now, to compensate for that, it's a lot of the personal exemptions were eliminated. Right? So you no longer have a personal exemption for each child. Right? Before, you would take those personal exemptions and then it would add up to some amount. Now you take the $24,000 and that embeds all of the things that you used to deduct. But it makes it a lot simpler. And then finally, a lot of the personal exemptions, were eliminated. And then also the deductions. A lot of itemized deductions were removed because a lot of itemized deductions are really spending through the tax code. Right? You want to spur something, so you can't pass a bill to spend the cash, so instead you fiddle around with the tax code in order to spur things to happen. Well, when you do that, it means you're not raising revenue, so you have to raise tax rates. So again, they were able to lower the tax rates by broadening the base and getting rid of a lot of deductions, and also the flattening out the personal exemptions or making it more uniform. Because the inefficiencies of the tax code is how people react to the complications of the code. And a lot of these are inefficient reactions. So if you can get rid of a lot of those, then you're raising revenue more efficiently. Because you have to raise revenue, right? There are things that you want the government to do, and you should try to raise that revenue with the lowest cost possible to the economy. And that's not really been the ethos of tax code writers since 1986. It's all been whittling away the reforms of that year. All right, but a lot of big movements towards making the tax code more efficient, right? Keeping those two principles of lowering the rates and broadening the base, which is good. Now, in terms of the overall effect of the tax code on revenue, because it's not just the tax rates that matter, it's also, for the economy as a whole, the size of government. Right? So if you're extracting money from the private sector with taxes, then the private sector just doesn't have this money to spend it as it wishes. So just the overall tax cuts and the amount returned to the private sector is also important, and you see that this was a fairly large bill. So this is over a 10-year period. These are some estimates. Roughly $225 billion a year in tax cuts, and most of the tax cut is in individual income taxes. That's the blue bars. And the orange bars on top of that, that's the corporate taxes. And then there's the little gray bars on top. That's mostly inheritance taxes. Right? There's a lot of discussion about the death tax, and that was, I think it's something like $11 million is the minimum amount before you get taxed on that. And that didn't collect much revenue, but you heard a lot about it anyway. And then you see the tax cuts dropping off in 2026. That's because all the personal tax cuts are set to expire in 2025. Right? So you add all this up, and overall, of the 10-year period, it was $1.8 trillion in taxes that were cut, where 1.1 trillion was from personal income taxes. But again, that's temporary. If this is made permanent, it would be more like 1.5 trillion. And the estate and gift tax is about 72 billion. So this is pretty big. Remember, the size of the federal government, the spending is $4 trillion a year. And its tax revenue is substantially less than that, so about 3.2 trillion. So this is a fairly big chunk in terms of the tax cut. Now that brings up another point, is that the tax cut means you now have a bigger deficit because there have been no spending changes. So although taxes are cut, so we say, well, tax cuts work, the tax cuts will work on something, but there's still an awful lot more work to be done to sort out the budget. And that's on the spending side. And I won't be talking too much about that, but you can ask me anything about that in the Q&A time. All right, now, while all of this debate was going on about the tax cut, there were competing stories about who was going to be affected. You know, it was a tax cut to take money from the middle class and give it to the 1%. You know, tax cut to give rich corporations more money. And largely that was because the rich pay taxes, and the middle class pays substantially less taxes than the rich, and the bottom half pay almost no income taxes, right? So the bottom half of the income distribution pays about 3% of all income taxes, personal income taxes. The top 1% pays almost 40% of income taxes. So if you're going to cut tax rates, the beneficiaries are going to be those who are currently paying taxes. You know, so obviously if you're cutting any taxes, those who pay are going to get the biggest benefits. But more than that, you know, that's kind of a phony argument. But more than that, if you count the growth effects, so I don't want you to look at all these numbers, just the circled ones. Part of the argument for having these tax cuts was to increase economic growth. You give more money back to the economy, you change the tax code, you'll get growth out of it. So when they do scoring of these tax bills, or any bills, they're all static impacts. So they don't take into account, by law, they used to not do it at all, take into account the economic effects of the tax cuts. So you wouldn't take into account, well, if you do this, you'll get growth, so you'll get more money back, or someone will benefit from the growth. So that's most of what they talk about are the static effects. And if you look at the top little oval there, the benefits are like 1.8% of income increase for the top 10% of the income distribution, and the bottom 10% only, or is it 20%, only gets, you know, 0.7%. But that doesn't take into account that the point of the tax code reforms was to increase growth. When you take growth into account, you get what's called dynamic effects. And you do dynamic scoring, not just static scoring. And the bottom table shows that. And you see that the beneficiaries of the growth are largely at the lower end of the distribution. Right? The extra effect from the growth, the rich, the well-off will get the benefits of the tax cut because they're paying taxes, but the beneficiaries of the growth is largely at the lower end. So it evens out the effects, the distributional effects of the tax cut when you consider the possible benefits of a growing economy that should be coming from the tax changes. Yeah, so the dynamic effects really broaden the benefits of the benefits across the income quantiles. Now, I should say that I'm taking all of these estimates from just one source, because I wanted to be consistent, the Tax Foundation, which is an excellent resource to find out about taxes, but these are kind of the most, probably optimistic, one of the most optimistic projections out there of the effect. So I want to give that proviso. There are other places that will do that have done estimates that are not nearly as optimistic as these. But these are certainly realistic, and you can get economists to disagree on anything. So I just picked one set of them. But not everyone, there are other estimates to keep in mind. Now, the question then becomes, well, how does this work? You give tax cuts to businesses. What sorts of things might happen? What do businesses do with this extra money? And the idea is that they'll take the money and not just pocket it. Right? If you're a business owner, you don't just pocket the money. You might pocket some of it because you need a return on your ownership. But it's that you'll use the extra money and maybe invest in new machinery, hire new workers, pay your workers more. So just to highlight some of the ways that these tax cuts can work through the economy to kind of generate growth, I have some examples that were collected by the Americans for Tax Reform. They were big supporters of the tax cuts, so they went out and collected all the good news. Here I've just put some of the good news just from the UP. And the sorts of things that can happen, so Black Rock's Brewery, this is quoted from April 26 in Market Watch. And this is an excellent job title that I didn't know existed. So it's, I don't know if you can read this. Dave Manson is the co-founder of Black Rock's Brewery and is the ambassador of fermentology at the brewery. It's fantastic. So economics professor doesn't sound nearly as sexy as it did until yesterday. All right, but so he said that his brewery is reinvesting the money. So the tax cuts that they got, they're reinvesting the money in equipment and personnel. So they're expanding their operation, hiring more people. And he's looking to expand output to get more beer on the shelves. And his beer is $8.99 per six-pack. And then it's $9.99 for a porter. Is it good? Well, it's beer, so it starts out with a head start. So that's one example, and this is a smallish business, the type that doesn't get in the news when they're arguing about it because they're talking about big corporations. But it's at the ground level. You say, well, I get more money, now I can expand my operations because I get to keep more of what I'm going to get as the fruit of my expansion. And then there were some examples from power companies, and I think you had mentioned that to take these with a grain of salt. We'll see. But they were written down and put on the internet, so that's fine enough. So this is the Upper Peninsula Power Company in Marquette, and they said that they were reducing monthly bills. So their monthly power bills to their consumers, the residential consumers, would fall by a total of about $8.30 per month, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you multiply that over all the people, so this is money put back into the economy for people to buy things. So that's another way that the money is injected back into the economy. It's not just so that businesses can invest, it's that maybe the money goes back to consumers and then they spend it and they become customers and then the businesses can benefit from being able to sell more. Another company in Iron Mountain is a U.S. Special Delivery. So they said that they gave $1,000 bonuses to all employees. So, and this is again from February, so this is right after the tax cuts were enacted. They gave $1,000 bonuses to their employees. So again, this is an injection of money into the economy, local economy, regional economy, and the national economy. So again, trying to spur economic activity. And then here's another energy company, Upper Michigan Energy Resources Corp., also in Iron Mountain. So this is an article about them proposing to the regulators to allow them to cut their rates. So again, money back into consumers' pockets. Although, they might actually be taking it and investing it. It was better press to say they were returning it, I guess. But you do hope that they're investing some more too. Now, it's not just local companies, but also branches of national companies and their operations. So I've highlighted a bunch here, which are national companies that have presence in the Upper Peninsula. So AT&T gave $1,000 bonuses and increased capital expenditure. So that's about 6,200 employees in Michigan overall. I don't know how many are in the UP. Any idea of AT&T? Just make up a number, and I'll agree to it. It's nearly 1,000 is what I heard. The next, TJ Maxx, right? So this is just there's a store. I think is this one that there's two in the UP, one here in Marquette, I think. Yes, and the other one is in Sioux, which is what you call, that's short for what? Sault Ste. Marie. So they took the money and gave out bonuses, increased retirement plan contributions, parental leave. So increased pay and benefits to their employees. So for Michigan-wide, that's 41 stores and 2 in the UP. But again, these are just examples because you can't always observe the effects of the tax cuts because you don't talk to every business. And some businesses maybe don't even identify, well, there's the tax cut, and then I did this. They say, well, I have this much more money left over, so I'm going to do something. And they don't attribute it to the tax cut. So these are just examples to highlight, again, the ways that it can be done and the things that can happen, but it's by no means exhaustive. All right, Home Depot, I believe there's one in Marquette. Okay, that's close. Okay. And so they gave out bonuses, up to $1,000 bonuses. Lowe's, is there a Lowe's in Marquette? That's what I thought. So also bonuses of up to $1,000. Walmart, now there's got to be a Walmart here. Okay. And a lot of Walmarts around the Upper Peninsula, I assume. So they also gave out bonuses, wage increases, and other benefits. And then McDonald's, they actually invested not in the stores, but in their people. So they increased tuition. They used the money to increase tuition support that they give to their employees. So this is a response because retention of good employees is difficult. So they said, well, we'll train them to keep them. All right, so again, these are just ways that the tax cuts generate into the economy, either back into the pockets of people to spend or for businesses to increase their investments. So all of this should, there we go, lead to growth, and you get growth because you've increased the capital stock. Right? This just means you've invested more, you have more machinery, more factories, more stores. So the estimates, again, from the Tax Foundation are that over the course of 10 years, the U.S. capital stock would be about 6% higher than it would be if tax reform hadn't been done. Now, this is cumulative, so it's not every year. It's just increase over the 10-year period. And that's actually quite a substantial amount. Changes like that don't just occur. That's a big effect in terms of how these things go. And the result of all that is estimated to be higher GDP of about 3%. So the total size of the U.S. economy should be about 3% bigger than without the tax code. So roughly about 0.25% added to annual growth, which is a huge amount. That's a small number, but it's a huge amount in terms of growth because average growth is something like 2 or 2.25% per year. So you're adding another 0.25% on top of that. So potentially a very big effect on economic growth. And economic growth filters down and increases real wages. So a lot of the benefits to the lower income quantiles that I'd shown is because of real wage increases that are anticipated. So not directly from the tax cuts, but from the tax cuts through investment and increased spending, and then increased demand for labor, higher wages, and then people at the lower quantiles end up benefiting from the changes to the tax code. So that's tax cuts, and that's how tax cuts can work. And again, these are the optimistic fairly optimistic projections on the effects of the tax cuts, but all projections are that there will be growth, and the ways that the growth would generate through the tax cuts are identical no matter how optimistic you are about the effects and what your projections are. So the story would be the same if you talk to anyone from Brookings, say, who has less optimistic projections instead of the tax foundation. But it's just really about the size of it. Now, one other thing I should mention is that there was some debate about when the tax cuts were put in. It's, well, the tax cuts will pay for themselves. Right? So you have the tax cuts, you generate growth, you end up with enough growth after 10 years, then you're able to collect more revenue because the economy is bigger. Okay, that's not true. Okay, the tax cuts are not paying for themselves. The tax cuts are having these benefits, so they work to generate GDP and wages, but they're a net loss in terms of revenue. So even when you do account for the extra growth. So there are still things to be done in terms of the U.S. finances. We have this year, I think it's projected to be I keep forgetting the scale, $1 billion deficit out of a $4 trillion budget. So that's a pretty large percent of spending that is on deficit financed. So that's not very good. And that's meant to increase. So the deficit should keep increasing every year and the debt piling up unless we tackle things on the spending side or raise taxes. But I will say with a more efficient tax code, which we do have a more efficient tax code, raising rates is not as costly as it used to be. So that's one possibility. But of course, over a long term, spending is just going to start increasing more rapidly as Social Security and healthcare spending by the federal government, which are by far the two biggest items, as they keep rising, as all of you young people in the room become slightly older, or a lot older, and start getting your returns on all those payroll taxes you've paid over the years. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions you have about anything in economics. Now, as Tony had mentioned, I was at the Federal Reserve for 12 years, and I know some of the secrets, so I'm happy to divulge them. And I would used to give talks, about 10 talks a year when I was a Fed economist, and I wasn't allowed to answer any questions. Well, I would take questions, but I couldn't actually say anything. So since I've left the Fed, I'm happy to let it rip, so you can take advantage of that.
Well, thanks, Howard. Excellent way you walked us through that. So what happens if in 2020 the administration changes? What powers do they have to change that? What's set into motion right now, if any?
So everything was changed through legislation, and the president signed it, so they would have to go through Congress and get tax increases. And I don't think that's very easy to do. But the alternative is to get spending cuts, which might be more difficult. But it's not executive action or anything like that. This was actually a lot of work, and it'd be a lot of work to reverse it.
So seeing a lot in the news just about people with unexpected high tax bills as a result. And what type of individual taxpayer is seeing some of the biggest unexpected increases?
So actually what you're seeing in the news is unexpectedly small refunds, which is actually a result of paying less taxes. Because the withholding was adjusted because of the tax code changes, so less was withheld. So when less is withheld, and you're going to pay less in the end, your refunds are going to be smaller. So a lot of people are being surprised that their refunds are smaller and attributing it to them paying more taxes. But it's actually they're paying fewer taxes over the course of the year. But it seems like, because you expect, I get this much back. But it's because withholding changes also, so the withholding's not been the same. But the type of people who would see tax increases are people in states with really high state and local taxes, because that deduction was dramatically reduced. I think it's about a $10,000 cap. So people in California and New York in particular, a lot of those people are paying higher taxes. Even middle-income New Yorkers and Californians are paying higher taxes out of this because of that SALT the smaller deduction in SALT, the state and local taxes. Is that it?
Yeah, it does. So, like, I have still 3 kids I can claim, and kids in college and all that stuff, and that itemized is going away, is that?
So also, people with a lot of kids can end up seeing higher taxes. Well, and something else. So I've always filed as a head of household, and the head of household category doesn't exist anymore. And that was better than filing as single or as a, so, but in net, I think I'm seeing a tax cut. But yeah, I think the more kids you have, well, tough. Because if it goes over 24,000, if it would have been, then you're sunk. So there was also a change to make how children are taxed. And I just came across this the other day, I didn't know. There's a kiddie tax, which is meant to avoid people shifting income to their kids, so that kids will be taxed at their parents' rate in some, with some formula. So if you are a high tax person, you're in the highest bracket, and you shift money to your kids, they're going to be charged your tax rate. So a lot of adjustments like that to get around those things. So they've figured it out.
Given the current political climate, particularly in Washington, D.C., what would you expect to see out of the conversations that will take place over the next couple of years?
So one of the best lines of any movie I've ever seen is from one of the Rocky movies. I forget which one it was with Clubber Lang. Is that Rocky 2? Or 3? 3, because he won the title and then Mr. T. So that's Rocky 3. Mr. T, or Clubber Lang, was asked what his prediction was for the fight. And he just answered, does anybody know? Pain. So if that helps.
Dave, I think that's what you were feeling, pain.
So if nothing happened on the spending front in 2 years with a Republican Senate, Republican House, and Republican President, then nothing's going to happen with a split Congress.
Okay, so when does the whole deficit piece actually become the issue? It continues to rise, and we continue to print money, and the house of cards eventually comes down unless we address it. And of course, Americans don't do anything until their backs are against the wall, right?
Yeah.
So, what's your vision for that?
Well, I'll repeat the answer to the previous question. But one of the reasons that two reasons that the ongoing deficit and piling up of debt, which is now $22 trillion, I'm sure I've mentioned that, was that we did have a very deep recession and a slow, drawn-out recovery. So there weren't a lot of pressure on prices, even though the money supply was being increased, and the Fed was on top of that. So, and inflation expectations are very, very low because there's a lot of trust in the Fed. And it's kind of like sausage, the story. You don't want to see how it's made. The sausage is fine in the end. And so having been in the Fed for 12 years, yeah, it's fine. Don't worry. So that's one, is that actually, I guess there are 3 things. The Fed is trusted, so the expectations of inflation are dampened because it's the expectations of higher prices that make you raise your prices now. So you don't really have that. And then it's the slow economy, or slowish economy. So that didn't let inflation take off. But on the budget side, the fact that the Fed was keeping interest rates so low meant that interest payments on the debt has been incredibly low. So the borrowing is very, very cheap. So there's not a lot of drain on the overall budget to pay interest. But the interest rates are starting to creep up again. And over time, as we, so I think the Treasury had actually turned a lot of it into long-term debt to take advantage of the low interest rates. So it won't be too much of a problem, but all of the new debt that's being taken on is at higher and higher interest rates. So once that kicks in and more of the debt is at the high interest rates, then you get a bigger chunk of the federal budget just going to pay interest. And then that means, well, you're going to spend less or you're going to have to tax more to do that. So in a lot of ways, the recession was a benefit and the slow recovery was a benefit to put off having to actually tackle the budget issues. But it could another recession, I don't know what, that would not be very good because there's not much you can do. And then that might, because the recession really kills tax revenue a lot, and another recession and the whole thing can really blow up. And I should say also that the reason that we're able to finance the deficit is that we have a relatively open economy. You know, the current administration complains about our trade deficit, which is $500 billion a year or something overall. But a better way to characterize that is a capital surplus. Because if we're sending money out to buy stuff, that same amount is coming back in to invest or to lend to Americans. If we somehow manage to reduce our trade deficit, that means we're not getting as much investment in, we're not getting as much borrowing. So that's another way that we'll do it. If we reduce trade, we'll really get the budget problem to be more of a challenge. But fortunately, all of the trade things that have been going to reduce trade has increased it. So our trade deficit has risen since the president has tried to reduce it. So far, so good.
Yeah, I'd always heard and read that the Kennedy and Reagan tax cuts actually resulted in a net increase in revenue. Is that not true?
It's not really true.
You seemed hesitant when you said not really true.
It increased it, but not to completely pay for the tax cuts, unless over like a really long period, or because then there were tax increases a few years later. Even Reagan cut taxes, and then he raised them a year and a half, 2 years later. There's a big tax cut or increase in 82, 83. So in the end, there was enough revenue to have covered it, but the deficits, well, in the Reagan ones, they lasted for a really long time. And what benefited there, again, was monetary policy had really clamped down. But in the end, no, that's not really. There are some taxes that are really high, and if you reduce it, then you increase revenue. But taxes are not quite that high where it ends up as a big net increase. It's not something to count on for sure. But again, I kind of had a question mark at the end of my answer because there is a debate over it, but the weight of it is that it's not really paying for it, entirely paying for the cuts.
Joe, I think you had a question.
To Dave's point about the deductions, so we talked a little bit about offsetting kind of deductions and stuff. Was there any real loopholes that were plugged substantially?
I think on the corporate side, there were a lot of loopholes that were cut because there were big changes. I didn't talk about that because I don't even understand them. The ones on international, bringing money from overseas. So there were a lot of, I don't know if it was there were a lot of problems there. And probably a lot of the corporate loopholes were cut. So, but not many in terms of the personal.
So maybe piggybacking on the question back here, when I looked at your slide about the static and the dynamic results of it, and of course those are models. You're modeling the future. And I think about in the past when there's been tax increases or tax cuts, and there seems to be mixed understanding or mixed reviews of what the actual results are. So really, how do we, in terms of this modeling, at what point do we really understand whether it is meeting what we expected it to?
Well, so the big problem is that all of these models doing projections about what would happen have a little proviso at the end that says all else constant. So if nothing in the world changes, then this is what will happen. But the rest of the world changes, so it's very hard, even after the fact, to know what to attribute everything to. So So I guess we'll never actually know. But what you do actually, the reason it's a good question because it's for all of these questions. There's debates and there's competing estimates of what would happen, and probably about 60% of the estimates out there are honest ones, and you have to figure out which are honest, and they're honest from both sides. So you could take, say, the Brookings Foundation, Brookings and the Tax Foundation. They'd be very different estimates of what happened, but they're both very, very honest. So you can look at them and just get a range of what might happen, and you get an idea of the risk. And because there are no certainties, but you get an idea of the risk, and then make an assessment on those grounds. If it's, you can't just cherry pick one of them. You have to look at the whole bunch of them, and then say, well, on average, the average is kind of the best. But then also the risk involved. What are the possible downsides and upsides to this? And in this, it's the range of things wasn't really that wide, but there was an awful lot of rancor across the honest projections. But there was an awful lot of rancor. So the answer is you can't really tell in the end, but our fingers crossed.
Okay, so I've got a good one for you, Mr. Wall. If you could make all the decisions for the economic policy of the United States that we would spend within our budget, and we would pay down our debt, and we'd get ourselves fiscally responsible, do you think, how would you do it? And I'm not going to ask if it's possible. I'm just going to ask, how would you do it?
Oh, it's absolutely impossible.
I know that.
And as I tell my students, I do a class on public policy, and I say, do not run on this platform if you want to get elected. So the platform is to actually have higher taxes on the middle class, and you do that by making the tax code actually a little less progressive. It's an odd view, but I think that the rich pay too much in taxes, and that the middle class should pay more because that's where all the money is, but not increase it too much. But you have to have dramatic decreases in spending. The Social Security system is it's set to take off, and you can make minor adjustments to that, where you can just do the inflation adjustment, make Social Security means tested, because right now Warren Buffett gets the same as anybody else, because it's this fiction that it's a retirement fund that's sitting there, and it's not. It's a welfare program like anything else. Money's taken in and spent. So that would need to be reformed and make it means tested and stop this fiction. And what else? That's two things. What other types of policies?
I'm just trying to see, could we become fiscally responsible, I guess, as a country?
I think those two things would get us about halfway there.
Okay.
And also dramatic changes in how we do welfare. The welfare reform of 1996 was one of the most incredible pieces of legislation in the United States history, because it really changed how we do welfare. Welfare agencies were supposed to become job centers. Like their job was to get people jobs, and that was gradually whittled away. And now that's almost gone. And there are all sorts of inefficiencies within the system to keep people out of work. And it's, people will face over 100% effective tax rate, because if they get a job and earn $5,000 more, they'll lose $6,000 in benefits. So I would also replace most of the welfare system with a negative income tax, which is a less dramatic version of the universal basic income, which is potentially everyone gets something, but it kind of declines as your market income rises. So this preserves a lot of the incentives to work, to get yourself out of poverty, or the disincentives to not work, I should say, while also being sensible budget-wise. But that one almost is in place. The earned income tax credit is a negative income tax under a different name. And that one actually might stand a chance to being broadened. But they do it without getting rid of all the other things. That's the harder part, is to replace. It's usually just on top.
We have time for 2 more questions before we wrap up. Do we have any more from the audience? I have one then that I'll ask, and maybe this will give you a chance to put a fine point on it. So given your years of experience with the Fed, your observations made of the way that sausage is made behind the curtain, and as you have followed closely, I'm sure, the policies, the decisions of the Fed in recent times, what would your observations and criticisms be of some of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years?
Well, actually, I'll go back even to the financial crisis because it's very telling, I think, of the Fed. So I was vice president at the Fed during the financial crisis. So every morning, we would be briefed on the new things that were being done, and they were happening so fast to try to bail out the financial sector. And you know, there are all sorts of things. Oh, the Fed is just trying to save rich people or whatever. All of that is bunk. I mean, it was really dedicated work, and people were just, you know, trying to do what they could. And it was really seat of the pants stuff because it was all new ground, and they were taken incredibly seriously. And I think actually the Fed did save the economy and reverse the financial crisis and stop it in its tracks. Now, the downside of that is that they became too political. They had to kind of work with the Treasury too much, and the Treasury are much better politically than a bunch of economists. So they were taken to the cleaners, and then there was the TARP and all that, which half of it was good, half of it was really disastrous. But since then, honestly, the Fed has just been making up stuff as they went along because it was all new situation, and they did a fantastic job. I mean, if you had thought that inflation was kept in check while they were basically printing money like wild, and that 10 years ago we'd be where we are today in the economy, you would have never dreamed of it. And here we are with fairly robust growth, low inflation, and it wasn't because they had models of what to do. They had no models of what to do, but they really did work hard and figure out how to do stuff. Now, it was really ugly, I'm sure, what was going on at the time, but in the end, it actually worked out pretty well. And I don't think they even know why it did, to be honest, if that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Wall, before you leave, we do have a gift we would like to present you with.
Okay,
Is it
join
beer?
me in thanking
Is it beer?
Dr. Hall, and while they're doing that,
We can take care of that.
I'd like for all of you to take a look on your tables. We have a tent there that gives you access to our evaluation. If you signed up, most of you did, we will also be sending out an email reminding you to send back the evaluation. Please let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and make suggestions for next year's speakers. Additionally, you'll find information on your tables about becoming members. Our members keep us bringing this event to you. It allows us to shout out for the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Everything that was presented today has been videotaped. Please think about who to nominate next year, because not only do they get to receive this prestigious award, we also have that video that they can put on their website in order to promote their business. And finally, it's all about connecting, communicating, and collaborating. Please go back to your offices and share these incredible stories and talk about how it is that when we see you next year, or you guys see each other next year, that you can celebrate even more bigger and better things that are happening across the Upper Peninsula. And it's with deep gratitude that I say thank you for coming and joining us today.
Donnie?
Yeah, thank you.
And my closing remarks will be brief. Safe travels to all of you as you go home. Enjoy a productive week. The UP 200, for those of you that are sticking around Marquette County. Board members, we are meeting immediately after across the hall. With that, thanks again.
Safe journey, everyone. Thank you.